This isn't about performance. Daisy. It's about optics. The room didn't react. No gasps, no awkward coughs. Just the soft hum of the projector, still displaying strategic realignment. Phase 1. As if my career had been reduced to a bullet point that failed to load. I was standing. Everyone else was seated. That detail stayed with me longer than the sentence itself. Vince Calder, our newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the slide. Vince always looked at slides. He spoke fluently about future-facing leadership, agile culture, brand confidence. He had never once sat across from a federal auditor with a closed notebook and a raised eyebrow. But today, he was decisive. You'll lose system access immediately, he continued. Voice smooth, no statements, no farewell email. We want a clean transition. Clean. That word again. Before we continue, a quick note: this story is fictionalized, inspired by real corporate dynamics, and shaped for education and emotional clarity. Some details were altered, and AI tools were used responsibly. If this isn't for you, feel free to step away and take care. If you're still here, thank you. 17 years. That's how long my name had lived quietly inside this company's risk reports. Not headlines, not press releases. Reports. I was the director of internal controls and compliance stability. The person you forgot existed precisely because nothing went wrong. My name appeared every quarter under the same phrase: low-risk confirmation. Reliable, boring, safe. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because discipline is a habit you don't break under pressure. Vince smiled. The way people do when they believe confidence substitutes for experience. Optics mattered more than outcomes now. Silence mattered more than structure. I was stability in a room chasing applause. As I walked out, my phone vibrated once before going dark. One last email slipped through before my access vanished. I didn't open it right away. I already knew it wouldn't be addressed to me later. In the elevator, I read the CC line: Board Visibility Review, sensitive. That's when the shock settled into something heavier, slower, colder. I wasn't removed because I failed. I was removed because I made failure too visible to ignore. And somewhere above us, the board was starting to ask questions. How are you holding up right now if you can? Take a moment to sit somewhere quieter. Just changing rooms can calm the mind. Let me know where you're listening from. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribing helps us keep going. Now back to what happened next. The week after I left, my work didn't go with me. That was the first thing I noticed. The dashboard still refreshed on schedule. The risk summaries still landed in executive inboxes every Friday morning. The language was familiar because I had written it. The conclusions were intact because they were accurate. Only my name was gone. I learned this not from gossip, but from habit. 17 years teaches you where to look. A former colleague forwarded a screenshot without commentary. The compliance dashboard looked cleaner than ever. Rows of green indicators, predictable confidence. And where my name used to sit, Director of Internal Controls and Compliance Stability, there was now a blank field. As if stability itself had become an automated feature. My replacement didn't take long to introduce herself. Lena Brookfield, Vice President of Strategic Transformation, young, sharp, effortlessly certain. She spoke in verbs, not cautions. She had never sat through a regulatory examination where silence mattered more than persuasion, but she knew how to present momentum. I remembered 2 moments the board never celebrated. The first was when I blocked a vendor partnership that looked profitable on paper and radioactive under scrutiny. Vince Calder had sighed that day and said I was being conservative. 6 months later, legal acknowledged quietly that the exposure would have triggered a federal inquiry. The second was a late-night call from finance, asking me to just approve a workaround. I didn't. The workaround disappeared. So did the problem. Now Lena stood in my old conference room. Clicking through slides, I recognized line by line. My framework, my thresholds, my language. Vince leaned back, nodding as if the ideas had arrived with her. When she finished, he smiled and said, "See, We're moving faster already. I wasn't there, but I could picture it perfectly. Speed being mistaken for progress, silence being mistaken for consent. I returned once to clear my desk. Security watched without speaking. No one said goodbye. I packed notebooks no one had ever read, a mug from an audit we survived, and left my badge on the table like an artifact from a version of the company they were eager to forget. That afternoon, an internal email circulated. Daisy Knox has voluntarily exited the organization. I read it twice, voluntarily. The word sat heavier than the termination letter. They hadn't just removed me. They had rewritten the sequence of events so it would never look like a choice they made. And that, more than the firing, was when the injustice finally tightened into something I couldn't swallow. It was easier to erase a name than explain why removing the one constant had suddenly made everything feel unstable to the people who understood risk best. I didn't argue. That surprised people more than anger ever could. There was no legal threat, no carefully worded LinkedIn post about gratitude and growth, no late-night message sent to the wrong executive on purpose. I did exactly one thing, and I did it by the book. I sent an exit acknowledgement. 2 paragraphs. Neutral tone, proper citations. I confirmed receipt of the termination notice, acknowledged the revocation of access, and affirmed ongoing compliance with confidentiality obligations. No emotion, no subtext. I signed it, dated it, and closed the file. Silence, in corporate terms, is not absence. It is a position inside the company. The system didn't pause to ask how anyone felt. Risk analytics never do. Models refresh whether people are ready or not. Inputs change. Variables adjust. Baselines recalculate. The organization had been trained, quietly, over years, to recognize my presence as a constant. I wasn't senior leadership. I wasn't a brand asset. I was a stabilizer. When I disappeared, the math noticed. I learned later that Mark Ellison saw it first. Mark ran enterprise risk modeling, a man who trusted numbers more than narratives. He didn't know me well. He didn't need to. He watched patterns. On his dashboard, a line dipped where it statistically shouldn't have. Senior tenure, low volatility, 0 disciplinary flags, sudden exit. The model labeled it, plainly, unexpected senior stability exit. No alert went out, no sirens. Just a quiet anomaly logged where anomalies didn't usually live. Mark leaned closer to the screen, recalibrated the filters, and ran it again. Same result. He checked peer benchmarks. Same discrepancy. It wasn't alarming. It was stranger than that. That's statistically odd. He said to no one in particular. Nothing happened immediately, which was the point. Systems don't accuse. They remember. They accumulate context and wait. My absence became a reference point, a negative space that data began to organize itself around. Decisions made after my departure carried slightly different weights. Approvals clustered. Overrides increased. Controls shifted just enough to be measurable. Not enough to be obvious. I went about my days calmly. I didn't watch. I didn't warn anyone. I trusted what I had spent 17 years helping to build. Stability, once removed, doesn't announce itself. It leaves a trace. And systems designed to protect organizations are very good at noticing when something reliable vanishes without a credible explanation. No one raised a flag that week. No one had to. The system had already made a note, and it wasn't finished paying attention. That kind of silence doesn't scream, doesn't threaten, doesn't rush outcomes. It simply waits, patient and precise. Until patterns harden into questions, leadership can no longer deflect without revealing who noticed first. Questions started arriving quietly, the way weather changes before anyone looks up. They didn't sound alarmed. They sounded polite, curious, almost friendly. An investor asked Vince Calder during an earnings prep call whether recent leadership changes had affected operational continuity. A partner delayed signing, citing a need to reconfirm governance alignment. No one used the word risk, but everyone was circling it. Vince handled it with the confidence of someone who believed tone could override substance. Routine transitions, he said more than once. nothing to see. He spoke as if repetition could stabilize reality. Lena Brookfield nodded beside him, flipping through slides that looked reassuring until someone asked where certain approvals now lived. That's when the questions shifted. They weren't accusatory. They were specific. Who reviewed cross-functional overrides last quarter? Why had escalation thresholds changed? Which committee signed off on exceptions that used to require independent confirmation? Lena answered carefully at first, then more slowly. These weren't her decisions. They were mine. Once. Or rather, they were the decisions I had stopped from being made. No one mentioned my name. That absence was intentional, but every inquiry traced the outline I'd left behind. I found myself thinking about how organizations talk when they don't want to admit loss. They talk around it. They describe shapes instead of naming what's missing, I wondered. Listening from the outside. How often leaders mistake discretion for invisibility? From my side, the tension felt different. It wasn't vindication. It was unease. I didn't want the company to fail. I had spent too many years preventing exactly this kind of drift. But there's a point where responsibility ends, and observation begins. I had crossed it. Let me ask you something, quietly, while the room was still holding its breath. When a company insists nothing has changed, yet everyone feels compelled to double-check, what does that tell you? Is stability something you declare, or something others recognize without being told? And when the most cautious voice disappears, does silence mean safety or simply delay? Those questions stayed with me as the board requested what they called a light, independent governance review. The phrasing was deliberate, not an audit, not an investigation, just a review. Harmless. On paper. But I knew better. Reviews exist to answer questions leadership no longer controls. The ground didn't collapse. It shifted, slowly enough for plausible deniability, strong enough to be felt by anyone standing still. And for the first time since I left, I sensed uncertainty spreading upward, searching for something solid to rest on, and realizing too late that the one constant it relied on was already gone. That realization unsettled them, not because answers were missing, but because the person who once framed those answers had been dismissed as expendable. And systems remember decisions long after people move on quietly forever. At this point, do you feel something is about to happen? I found out how people describe my exit when a headhunter asked me a question that sounded almost admiring. We were speaking casually, the way professionals do when they want context without committing judgment. She paused, then said, "Why did you leave so cleanly?" I didn't answer right away. Cleanly implied choice, cleanly implied grace. It implied that I had walked away with options spread neatly in front of me, that I had planned my departure like a well-managed transition. None of that was true, and correcting it mattered more than defending myself, because I wasn't leaving. I said I was being removed. The line surprised her. It surprised me too, not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. For the first time since the meeting, I named the action without softening it. I didn't add blame. I didn't explain motives. I stated the fact and let it sit. There is a difference between accusation and clarity, and I had no interest in crossing it. She asked, gently, whether I wanted to share details, documents, context. I declined. Not because I didn't have them, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something that takes years inside institutions to learn. Justice pursued too loudly becomes self-serving. Truth, when it's solid, doesn't require narration. I chose not to speak badly about anyone. I chose not to forward emails or highlight inconsistencies. I chose not to correct the story they were telling about me, even when it was inaccurate. That restraint wasn't weakness, it was ethics. I had spent my career insisting systems matter more than personalities. I wasn't going to contradict that belief when it finally cost me something personal. If the system was honest, it would speak without me. And if it wasn't, my commentary wouldn't fix it. I went back to ordinary days, calls, notes, silence. I didn't monitor headlines or internal chatter. I trusted the mechanisms I had helped reinforce. the ones designed to surface patterns leadership preferred not to see until it was unavoidable. Walking away didn't absolve me of responsibility, but it did release me from control. Then the notice arrived. Independent audit commencing Monday. I read it once. Then again, slower the second time, Monday. The date landed with a weight that felt deliberate, even if it wasn't. Monday was the same day I had signed my final quarterly stability confirmation, years earlier, affirming that controls were intact and governance sound. It was the day that had always marked continuity. Now it marked inquiry. I didn't smile. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was calm, edged with resolve. I hadn't asked for justice. I hadn't demanded correction. I had simply stepped aside and let the structure respond to its own disruption. And somewhere inside that structure, a process was beginning that no single executive could redirect without exposing exactly why it existed in the first place. When the audit began, nothing dramatic happened. No alarms, no frantic emails, no executives rushing into conference rooms. That was the unsettling part. Audits that uncover crimes announce themselves quickly. This one didn't. It moved slowly, methodically, as if it already knew where to look and had no interest in theater. The auditors didn't accuse anyone. They asked for timelines, approval matrices, escalation logs. They compared versions. They traced authority flows, on paper. Everything appeared compliant. No missing signatures. No forged numbers. No obvious violations. Vince Calder seemed relieved. See, he told the leadership team, clean review so far, but patterns don't need villains to speak. By the second week, questions started clustering around a single point when processes changed. Approval thresholds that once required cross-functional confirmation now moved through fewer hands. Controls designed to slow risky decisions had been streamlined. Streamlined was the word Lena Brookfield used, smiling carefully. We reduced friction, she said. Improved velocity. Velocity toward whom? The auditors didn't ask out loud. They mapped authority after my departure and noticed something subtle. Decision paths narrowed. Oversight converged. Vince's office appeared more frequently in final approvals. Lena's name surfaced beside exceptions that previously would have stalled. None of it was illegal. All of it was measurable. Vince tried to manage the scope. Let's focus on current operations. He suggested during a status call, historical processes aren't relevant anymore. His tone was cooperative, reasonable. He framed it as efficiency, not control. The lead auditor nodded, took notes, and said nothing. In the interim report, a single line appeared beneath a paragraph of neutral language. Management influence observed. No adjectives, no conclusions, just a notation. Precise enough to matter later. That was when I felt the first crack. It wasn't panic yet. It was discomfort. Meetings ended faster. Emails multiplied. Lena asked legal for clarification more often. Vince requested briefings he used to delegate. Confidence thinned, replaced by vigilance. Then the request came. We'd like to expand the review period, the auditor said. Voice even. To include governance practices prior to the last leadership transition. No one needed clarification. Prior meant before me, before my exit acknowledgement, before the clean break they thought they controlled. The room went quiet, not shocked. Calculating, from the outside. I understood what they were realizing in real time. You can remove a person, but you can't reset the baseline they established. By extending the timeline, the audit wasn't looking for wrongdoing, it was looking for contrast. And contrast, once documented, has a way of turning calm processes into visible fractures that no amount of composure can seal again. What unsettled them most was realizing the audit wasn't accelerating toward answers, but widening patiently, creating space where confidence eroded. Authority hesitated, and every prior decision waited quietly to be compared without protest or defense. Before I go on, how do you think this will end? Control slipped quietly at first. Then all at once, Vince Calder called an emergency meeting before the auditors even asked for one. as if urgency itself could reverse momentum. He stood at the head of the table and blamed legacy processes for everything that felt unstable. Old frameworks, old habits, old caution. According to him, the past was the problem, not the present. Lena Brookfield didn't nod this time. She crossed her arms and said, flat and precise, "This wasn't my framework." The room stiffened. It was the first open resistance I'd heard about since I left. Vince shot her a look meant to signal unity. But unity only works when everyone believes in the same story. Lena didn't, neither did legal. Judging by their silence, the auditors laid the comparison out without commentary. During my tenure, risk flags appeared early and resolved cleanly. Approvals were slower. Yes, but consistent. After my departure, exceptions multiplied. Controls overlapped without clear ownership. Authority paths narrowed. Then tangled. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just friction replacing structure. I have a question for you, and I asked it of myself while watching this unfold. When leaders blame legacy systems, are they addressing flaws or erasing accountability? And when speed becomes the metric, everyone celebrates. Who measures what gets lost along the way? I'm curious how you see it, because this moment felt familiar in ways spreadsheets never show. Inside the company, people began making private decisions. A senior controller announced early retirement. A compliance manager accepted an offer elsewhere. These weren't defections driven by fear. They were exits driven by clarity. Experienced people recognize instability before it earns a name. They don't wait for conclusions. They move when patterns change. Vince doubled down. He scheduled more meetings, demanded alignment, insisted the audit was routine. His tone sharpened. Authority, when questioned, often grows louder before it collapses inward. Lena stopped volunteering ideas. She started documenting instead. That shift mattered. The comparison phase ended, and something worse replaced it: anticipation. Everyone knew what the data implied, even if no one said it out loud. The organization had been calmer with fewer shortcuts, safer with slower approvals, stronger with one less executive signature. Then the email arrived from a major partner. We're pausing until governance clarity is restored. It was brief, polite, final. That was the moment opposition turned into desperation. Control wasn't just slipping anymore. It was being quietly withdrawn by people who no longer trusted explanations. Leaving leadership alone with consequences they could no longer delegate away. The collapse didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with headlines. One morning, my phone filled with messages containing the same link, shared without commentary, as if explanation would only cheapen it. Company faces governance review after senior stability exit. No accusations, no conclusions. Just the suggestion that something once trusted had been disturbed. Markets reacted the way they always do when certainty wavers. The stock dipped, recovered slightly, then dipped again. Analysts called it volatility. Internally, it felt like erosion. Customers postponed renewals. Longtime partners asked for reassurances that never sounded reassuring when repeated. Reputation, I realized, doesn't wait for facts. It moves ahead of them, filling the silence with assumptions. Vince Calder tried to steady the narrative. He gave interviews that said little and internal updates that said too much. This review is procedural, he insisted. It reflects our commitment to transparency. What he never managed to explain was simpler and damaging. Why I had been removed at all. That question followed him. Reporters phrased it politely. Investors framed it as curiosity. Employees whispered it in hallways Vince no longer walked through comfortably. Why Daisy Knox? Why now? Why the person who never generated headlines, never triggered alerts, never required cleanup? The audit team didn't speculate. They waited. Their job wasn't to interpret reputation. It was to document contrast. During a closed session, the lead auditor finally asked what everyone else had been circling for weeks. Why was your lowest risk executive eliminated? The room froze. Vince answered once, then stopped. He tried again. Leaning on optics, alignment, transformation. Each explanation contradicted the last. None addressed the risk profile staring back from the report. Silence followed, not because the question was hostile, but because it was precise. I read about that moment later, described by someone who had been there. They said it wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was ordinary. A question asked calmly, answered poorly, then recorded. By then, customers had already moved on, not loudly, not angrily. They simply chose safer ground. Employees continued leaving, citing uncertainty rather than fear. The company didn't implode. It thinned, watching from a distance. I understood something I had spent years trying to teach without naming. Reputation collapses before truth arrives. It collapses when leaders can't explain their own decisions in plain terms. And once that happens, no amount of composure can restore what hesitation has already taken away, permanently irreversible. The reckoning didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived as procedure, which made it colder and harder to argue with. One afternoon, while I was reviewing notes for a consulting call, I received a short message from someone still inside. Vince Calder had been asked to step aside. Not fired, not disgraced, just removed from decision-making while governance matters were addressed. That phrasing mattered. In corporate life, being asked to step aside is worse than termination. It implies loss of trust without the dignity of finality. Vince disappeared from calendars, from approval chains, from conversations that suddenly no longer required his voice. His authority didn't explode. It evaporated. Lena Brookfield was reassigned soon after. Not blamed, not absolved, shifted into a role with less exposure, fewer signatures, and no public rationale. Watching that from the outside, I felt no satisfaction, only recognition. Systems don't seek revenge. They rebalance. A week later, the board reached out to me. The message was formal and restrained. We'd like your perspective. No apology, no explanation, just a request. As if 17 years could be condensed into an hour-long call, I replied with one sentence. I already gave it. For 17 years. That response wasn't defiance. It was truth. Every caution I'd raised, every process I'd reinforced, every decision I'd slowed down had been my perspective. Delivered consistently and without theatrics. They hadn't missed it. They had chosen to ignore it. The audit concluded quietly. No press conference, no dramatic findings. The final report stated exactly what the data supported. No fraud found. Governance failure confirmed. It was devastating in its restraint. No villains, no heroes, just a documented pattern of decisions that weakened oversight once stability was removed. That was justice, as institutions understand it, not emotional, not restorative, simply accurate. When people ask me now how it felt, I struggle to explain. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. The system had done what I believed it would do. Eventually, without my intervention, it had compared before and after, named the difference, and reassigned consequences accordingly. I didn't get my job back. I didn't want it. What I received instead was something quieter and more durable. Confirmation that integrity leaves a measurable trace, and that removing it carries a cost leadership can delay, but never permanently avoid. That knowledge settled in calmly, like a verdict without applause, reminding me that justice in complex systems rarely feels satisfying, but it endures long after egos, titles, and explanations have faded away for everyone involved. I didn't feel reborn in any dramatic sense. There was no announcement, no victory lap, no need to explain what had happened to anyone who already understood how systems really work. I accepted a role as an independent governance advisor at another firm. Quietly, after a short conversation that focused more on principles than titles, the work felt familiar in the right way. I reviewed frameworks, asked uncomfortable questions, and left space for people to think before acting. No one asked me to fix anything quickly. They asked me to keep things honest. That was enough. I didn't feel bitterness toward my former company. I didn't celebrate its losses. What I felt was distance. the kind that allows clarity without resentment. Watching from afar. I saw the audit report released. My name appeared 27 times, not attached to mistakes, but referenced as a benchmark, a standard, a point of comparison leadership could no longer dismiss. That was the quiet satisfaction, not revenge, not restoration, but recognition without performance. I hadn't been erased, I had been removed, temporarily, from view. They didn't lose the company when they fired me. They lost it when they forgot why I was there in silence, for years. I thought my value came from being indispensable, from knowing every process, every risk, every quiet flaw in the system. What I learned instead is that true value shows itself most clearly when it's taken away. Stability isn't loud. Integrity doesn't advertise. But when they disappear, everyone feels the difference at once. There's something deeply human in that realization. We spend so much of our lives trying to prove ourselves, to be seen, to be applauded, when often the most meaningful work is the kind that leaves no trace until it's gone. If you've ever been the person who held things together quietly at work, in your family, in your community, you know how invisible that can feel. And you also know how painful it is when that steadiness is dismissed as replaceable. What stayed with me most wasn't the collapse, but the calm that followed. I didn't need to shout to be right. I didn't need revenge to feel whole. I needed to trust that doing the right thing, consistently and without spectacle, still matters even when it cost you. I'm curious how this story landed with you. Did you stay until the end because you recognized something familiar in it? What value or message stood out to you the most? And where are you listening from right now if this story resonated? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters here. And if you found meaning in this journey, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Stories like this only continue because people choose to stay, reflect, and pass them on.